Hello guys, welcome to a new chapter of the Empress Dowager Cixi. This is gonna be chapter 11, Modernization Accelerates, 1875 to 1889. In early 1875, Cixi lost a son, but regained power. The year became an extraordinary milestone, packed with groundbreaking events. The first thing she did was to summon Earl Lee to discuss an overall strategy for modernization. The Earl, who was based in Tianjin, had requested such a meeting in 1872, but at the time, feeling vulnerable and about to retire, she had turned him down. Now she saw him the day after he arrived, then the following day, and then for a third time a few days later. Her eagerness to resume her course and to regenerate the country was palpable. The Earl had by now emerged as the foremost modernizer of the country. He had surrounded himself with Westerners and made friends with many of them. Among their number was former US President Ulysses S. Grant, and the two men saw a great deal of each other in Tianjin in 1879. The missionary Timothy Richard described the Earl thus. Physically he was taller than most, intellectually he towered above them all, and could see over their heads to the far beyond. The Earl became the key man in Cixi's modernization drive. He and Prince Gong, who headed the Grand Council, and whose name was to Westerners synonymous with progress in China, were now the Empress Dowager's right-hand men. With their assistance, Cixi steadily, yet radically, pushed the empire towards modernity. As Earl Lee wrote to Cixi expressing their shared aspiration, "From now on, all sorts of things will be introduced into China, and people's minds will gradually open up." They did not exclude the conservatives. Cixi's style was to work with people like Grand Tutor Wang, as well as the reformists, always persuasion rather than brute force, and being prepared to let time and reason change people's minds. Cixi had wanted to send diplomatic representatives abroad a decade earlier. Now they were dispatched. On 31st of August 1875, she announced her first appointment, Guo Xiongtao, as the minister to London. Guo was an exceptionally forward-looking man who advocated learning from the West and adopting projects such as railways and telegraphs. He was furiously assailed by the conservatives. Grand Tutor Wang, in his diary, dismissed him as perverse, and the literati from his province who were in Beijing taking imperial examinations talked heatedly at their gatherings about going and tearing down his house. Cixi comforted him, seeing him 3 times with Empress Sen before his departure. The two women repeatedly told him not to be deterred by ridicule and slander. "Everyone working in the Foreign Office is a target of abuse," they said, "but the throne knows and appreciates you. You must take on this difficult job for the country." While Guo was abroad, his diary recording his impressions was published by the Foreign Office. In it, he described the British adoringly. Their legal system was fair. The prisons were exquisitely clean with polished floors, without foul air. One forgets that this is a prison. And their manners were courteous with a lone assertion. It showed that it is not by accident this country is so rich and powerful. He even suggested that China's 2,000-year-old monarchical system was not as desirable as British parliamentary monarchy. Although some of his remarks, for example, that Chinese manners fall far shorter than the British, were deleted for publication. The first installment of the diary excited teeth-gnashing hatred for literati officials, who accused Guo of trying to turn China into a British subordinate, and called on the throne to penalize him. Publication of the diary was forced to halt, but Guo was not rebuked. Instead, Cixi made him minister to France as well as to Britain, disregarding conservative officials' protestations. When Guo conducted a very public row with his traditionalist deputy in London, she transferred the deputy to Germany. Eventually, unable to get on with other mandarins, Guo asked to resign, and she accepted. She told his successor, Marquis Seng Jr., son of the late Marquis Seng Suofang, that she knew that Guo was a good man and did a remarkable job. Cixi may not have agreed with all of Guo's views, but she appreciated his independent mind, and her style was to work with people of different persuasions. Her minister to Berlin, Hung Jung, was quite the opposite of Wu. He disliked European customs, especially those to do with male-female association. Outside official duties, he preferred to shut himself in his residence, carrying on with his research on Chinese history, going out only for walks in the Tiergarten. The consort he brought to Berlin, a concubine who had been a high-class call girl by the professional name of Prettier Than Golden Flower, yearned for parties, but was not allowed to attend, even when Hung gave receptions at home. She would dress up exquisitely, sashay demurely downstairs to greet her guests, and then retire upstairs for the rest of the evening. When on rare occasions she stayed at a party, she was unable to dance, not only on account of her husband, but also because of her crushed and bound feet, which made it painful for her to walk or even stand. She remembered bowing to the Kaiser and the Empress and being paid compliments about her beauty by a glowing-faced, silver-bearded, piercing-eyed and courteous but distant Chancellor Bismarck. And that was all. She had also lost most of her servants, who had refused to cross the ocean with them, except for 2 who gritted their teeth for what they were certain would be a journey of no return, and who were paid 50 taels a month each, far more than the monthly income of an average official in Beijing, and 10 taels more than the German maids she hired in Berlin. She remarked that the German maids were extremely considerate and very good at looking after people. They were more loyal and far more obedient than Chinese servants. But even Hung Jung could not remain entirely resistant to his new surroundings. At first, he indignantly refused to wear European socks. Then, the realization that they were immeasurably more comfortable than the rough cotton ones he had brought from home dissolved his resolution. By the time he left Berlin, he had bought an ice sledge as a gift for the Empress Dowager. By the mid-1880s, with Cixi constantly urging no foot dragging, Beijing had geared up to dispatch a group of officials to travel around the globe and study Western institutions and cultures with a view to reforming their own system. And when applicants had been sought from the ministries, many escorts had eagerly put their names forward, a far cry from a decade earlier. Dealing with the West was no longer regarded as a hardship or as shameful. Jobs that involved associating with foreigners were now coveted. Contemporary diaries and newspapers exclaim how much society had changed. Even the sacred imperial examinations that had underpinned the political and social structure for well over 1,000 years were experiencing their first signs of modernization. The applicants for the trips were told to write essays for their exams on such subjects as the railway, defense, trading ports, and the history of China's interaction with Western countries since the Ming Dynasty. These were mind-expanding subjects that spurred people on to learn new things and think new thoughts. Some candidates found the transformation unsettling and struggled to square the new with the old. One claimed that the essence of chemistry and steam engines could be traced to the teachings of Mozi, one of the Confucian sages in the 5th to 4th centuries BC. One group of people enjoyed immediate benefit from the regime's active diplomacy, the victims of the slave labor trade, which had started from the late 1840s, mainly in Cuba and Peru. They number hundreds of thousands. In 1873-1874, the Qing government had dispatched commissions to investigate their conditions. The commission to Cuba reported 8/10 of the entire number declared that they had been kidnapped or decoyed. On arrival at Havana, they were sold into slavery. The large majority became the property of sugar planters. The cruelty displayed is great and unendurable. The labor too on the plantations is shown to be excessively severe, and the food to be insufficient. The hours of labor are too long, and the chastisements by rods, whips, chains, stocks, etc. are productive of suffering and injury. During the past years, a large number have been killed by blows, have died from the effects of wounds, and have hanged themselves, cut their throats, poisoned themselves with opium, and thrown themselves into wells and sugar cauldrons. In Peru, they were found to be treated equally appallingly. Beijing was in negotiation with the two countries in an attempt to protect the laborers when Cixi resumed power in 1875. She stressed to her negotiators, heard by Early, "You must find ways to make absolutely sure that such abuse of the Chinese is strictly prohibited and discontinued." The subsequent conventions freed the slave laborers and banned the trade. Cixi appointed one of her best diplomats, Chen Lanbin, who had been the chief investigator in Cuba, to be the minister to America, Cuba and Peru, with a major responsibility for looking after the immigrants. In 1875, efforts redoubled to build a world-class navy, mainly because of China's neighbor Japan was becoming increasingly aggressive and had just tried to take the island of Taiwan. Cixi and her inner circle had registered the rise of Japan before her retirement in early 1873, as they watched learning from the West. It was buying machines, gunboats, railways and weapons. Her court now discussed how best to deal with their biggest threat, and Cixi approved 4 million taels of silver a year, which was a huge budget, to build up the navy. It was the time when ironclad warships had just been invented in Europe, and her edict on May 30th authorized Early to purchase 1 or 2, given that they were astronomically expensive. In the years following the edict, 2 ironclads and a group of other warships were purchased. Young men were sent to France to learn how to manufacture them, and to Britain to train as naval officers. Germany was the destination for army cadets. Finally, in 1888, Cixi approved the Western-style navy regulations. It was in endorsing these regulations that she effectively unveiled China's first national flag. The country had had no national ensign until its engagement with the West at the beginning of her reign necessitated a triangular-shaped gold and yellow flag for the nascent navy. Now she endorsed its change into the internationally standard quadrangular shape. On the flag, named the Yellow Dragon, was a vividly blue animated dragon raising its head towards a bright red globe, the sun. With the birth of its national flag, remarked contemporary Western commentators, China proudly took her proper place among the nations. In the autumn of the momentous year of 1875, Robert Hart, the Ulster man and Inspector General of Customs, was commissioned to write a memorandum aimed at a wholesale expansion of foreign trade. He did so following the explicit instructions that he must bear in mind how all-important it is that his proposals should be advantageous and not harmful to China. Soon, more ports, mainly along the Yangtze River into the heartland, all the way up to Chongqing, were open to international trade. These doors were not wrenched open by force. Cixi's government opened them willingly in response to a request from Thomas Wade. In Philadelphia, USA, a Chinese official participated in the World Expo for the first time, with a brief to record and report back all of his experiences. Among the modern institutions introduced by Hart was the Chinese Post Office, which issued the country's first set of stamps, Great Dragons, in 1878. The meaning of the old adage, "Make China Strong," was expanded to incorporate "Make the Chinese Rich," Chi Fu. It was now the consensus in Cixi's circle that China's weakness lies with its long-standing poverty, and it could only become wealthy through Western-style industrial projects. We must gradually adopt the same things so we can get out of poverty and become rich as well. These projects had been proposed by Hart and Wade a decade earlier, but then the ancient land had not been ready for them. All those journeys to the west had opened eyes and minds. In 1875, Cixi ordered the installation of the telegraph, first in Fujian province, for communication with Taiwan, the island that Japan coveted and Cixi was determined to keep. The Imperial Telegraph Administration was founded, with one of the country's pioneering modern businessmen, Sheng Xuanhai, as its managing director. At first, crowds pulled down the wires and poles, but as people saw how harmless they were, how miraculous communication could be, and how many benefits it could bring to their lives, sabotage stopped, and telegraph lines began to extend all over the empire. Also in 1875, Cixi decreed the beginning of modern coal mining by designating 2 trial areas. Resistance was strong and the fears numerous. not least that China's underground treasures were about to be stolen by foreigners. Addressing this concern, Cixi ordered specifically, "We must keep decision-making power in our hands when we employ foreign personnel. Don't let foreigners control everything and make crucial decisions for us." One of the two sites was on the island of Taiwan, and the other was Kaiping, some 160 kilometers to the east of Beijing. Western technicians soon arrived with machinery, and Cixi appointed another outstanding pioneering businessman, Tong Cixi, as managing director. Tong had acquired his expertise while working for Western firms, and had founded China's first merchant shipping company, Tong and Sheng, together with other first-generation industrialists and businessmen, heralded the rise of the middle class, while Kaiping became the cradle of modern Chinese industry. A giant industrial center, Tangshan grew from here. Outside these state projects, individuals were given incentives to look for outcrops and open mines. To solve funding problems and encourage entrepreneurs, Cixi decreed that private businessmen should be allowed to issue shares. With coal came electricity. Cixi led the way by having electric lights installed in the Sea Palace by 1888. Generators were brought from Denmark and operated by the Praetorian Guard. There were the first electric lights outside the electric treaty ports and simulated the spread of electricity. In the next few years, 17 electricity companies for civilian as well as military and commercial use were founded in Beijing and other cities. By 1889, Beijing had seen its first tram. Cixi also set her heart on replacing the country's outdated currency, silver ingots, with manufactured coins. These ingots put China at a huge disadvantage in international trade because their silver content varied. They tended to be valued too low. Only modern minting could solve this problem, as well as make the Chinese currency compatible with the outside world. It was no small undertaking, especially as it required a sizable initial investment. Facing stubborn resistance, Cixi was adamant and offered to pay the startup cost of the royal household allowance. The project took off with a proviso that it would be reviewed in 3 years. The most conspicuous project that Cixi did not launch in 1875 or in subsequent years. It was the railway. It touched on something akin to religion. The numerous ancestral tombs dotted across the country, all lovingly built by their families in accordance with Feng Shui, could not be moved, nor could they be left where they were if they were near a railway line. People believed that the dead souls would be disturbed by the roaring trains. Cixi wholeheartedly believed that the tombs were sacrosanct. There was also the problem of funding. For 3 years after Cixi returned to power, between 1876 and 1878, nearly half the Chinese provinces and up to 200 million people were hit by floods, drought, and swarms of locusts, the biggest succession of natural calamities in more than 200 years and one of the worst in recorded history. Millions died of famine and disease, especially typhus. Traditional ways of coping with famines included the court praying for good weather, opening the royal purse, exempting areas affected from tax, and providing the Chinese equivalent of soup kitchens or rice centers. Now, unprecedented sums were spent on importing food from overseas. In such circumstances, the building of railways would have had to rely on foreign loans, something Cixi had no experience of. She was cautious. "We will have to borrow tens of millions," she said, "and we could land ourselves in trouble." To showcase the railway, British merchants built a 20-kilometer line from Shanghai to its outer port, Wuzhong, in 1876, the first to come into service in China. Villagers and officials were aghast. One day, when a train was running, a group of men, women, and children stepped onto the track and forced it to a halt. When the train moved off, the group grabbed at the carriages in a futile attempt to stop it again. Another day, a man was run over by the train, and it looked like it might spark a riot. Thomas Wade persuaded the British company to stop the service. Cixi's government bought the railway and had it dismantled to satisfy both parties. It is often claimed that Cixi stupidly had this, China's first railway, thrown into the sea. In fact, it was wrapped up and shipped across the straits to Taiwan, with the intention of using it at the coal mine there. The indigenous people of Taiwan did not feel as strongly about their tombs as the mainland Chinese, and because the island was less densely populated, there were fewer tombs anyway. As it happened, the land was unsuitable and had to be shipped back to the mainland, in the hope that it might be used at Kaiping. Here again, the area that the railway would cross was relatively barren and sparsely populated, with few tombs. It was only because Kaiping's English chief engineer, Claude W. Kinder, decided far-sightedly to adopt the standard gauge that the Wusong line, with its narrow gauge, was finally left to rust. After the Kaiping line was laid, 10 kilometers long, some concern was expressed that the few dead souls in the vicinity might be disturbed, so the train was pulled by horses. Then, cautiously, the horses were replaced by a locomotive, built locally under the supervision of Kinder and named the Rocket of China. Opposition went on and off and finally died down. But whether or not to build a more expensive system in China remained the most difficult decision for Cixi. For more than a decade, she repeatedly invited debates amongst the elite. Views were sharply divided, and the usually decisive Empress Dowager was uncharacteristically hesitant. All the arguments in favor, championed by Li, about how the railway will be good for defense, transportation, travel and communication, were not enough to convince her that a core belief of the population should be violated, or that the country should raise potentially crippling loans from the West. In the end, Cixi decided to try to train herself. In 1888, she bought a train with 6 carriages, and a 3 to 5 kilometer line was built by a French company, and it was to be installed inside the Sea Palace. The whole thing, including packing and shipping, cost 6,000 taels, a fraction of the real price. Western manufacturers were competing with each other to win Chinese contracts, and years earlier Britain had offered a similar train as a wedding present to her son, an idea and gift that had been at the end declined. Now Li supervised the purchase. He reported to Cixi that while the price was symbolic, everything was beautifully made in Paris, including a most luxurious carriage for her. The railway was laid with the guidance of a court feng shui master, who dictated when the construction could start and in which direction it should proceed. Digging towards the north, he said, was out of the question for that year, and so the northbound section had to wait until the 10th day of the first month of the following year, 1889. On that day, ground was broken between 3 and 5 p.m. When the line was operational, Cixi took a ride and got the feel of a real train, if only for a few brief moments. She tasted the speed and the comfort of traveling. Although she also saw the black smoke and heard the clanking engine. The train was stored away, only to be taken out to show visitors, and on those occasions eunuchs pulled the carriages using long yellow silks twisted into ropes. Around the time of this personal experience in April 1889, Viceroy Zhang Xidong put forward a unique and powerful argument that finally made up Cixi's mind in favor of a railway network. The Viceroy, 2 years Cixi's junior at 52, a short man with a long flowing beard, was a major promoter of modernization. Western contemporaries called him a giant in intellect and a hero in achievement. Cixi had first noticed him earlier, soon after her coup, during an imperial examination. His final essay on current affairs was bold and unconventional and had disconcerted the examiners, who slotted him at the bottom of the pass grade. But when Cixi read the essay, she recognized a like-minded spirit and upgraded him to number 3 of the whole empire. Over the years, she adopted many of his proposals and promoted him to key posts, now Viceroy governing 2 crucial provinces in the Yangtze Valley. The Viceroy's clinging argument was that the railway could bolster exports, which, he pointed out, were the key to enriching the population and the country in the era of international trade. At the time, the main exports from China remained tea and silk, while imports were rising steeply, due largely to the modernizing projects. The country's trade deficit stood more than 32 million tiles in 1888, and the future looked worrying as the quantities of tea exported had begun to fall. In 1867, China had supplied 90% of the Western world consumption, but now, teas from British India and elsewhere had entered the global market. It was imperative that the range of export was expanded. With this in mind, Viceroy Zhang proposed building a 1,500-kilometer trunk line from Beijing to the south, through inland provinces all the way to Wuhan, a major city connected to the sea by the Yangtze River. All the landlocked provinces in the catchment area will then be linked with the outside world. Local produce could be refined by imported machines and made exportable and then transported to the coast. Potentially, this could transform China's economy and solve its most fundamental and disabling problem, poverty. The visionary proposal struck Cixi. Here were the real benefits of the railways, and they would be worth all the sacrifices and the risks. She kept the Viceroy's proposal for deliberation. After soliciting scrutiny from the top echelon and receiving no objections, on August 27, 1889, Cixi finally issued a decree that heralded China's railway age with this north-south trunk line. The Beijing-Wuhan Railway, subsequently extended south to Canton, became and remains the country's central transport artery, critical to its economy even today. Cixi seems to have foreseen this, for her decree ran like a manifesto. This project has magnificent and far-reaching significance, and is indeed the key component of our blueprint for making China strong. As we embark on this groundbreaking project, unavoidably there will be doubts and fears. She went on to order the provincial chiefs, through whose territory the line will travel, to explain the enterprise to the local people and prevent them from obstructing it. All in all, she said, I hope the court and country will be of one mind. The officials and the merchants will make concerted efforts to achieve a complete success. Viceroy Zhang was put in charge of the construction, together with Earl Lee, and set up headquarters in Wuhan. There, associated with the railway, he initiated a host of modern industries and made Wuhan one of the crucibles of China's industrialization. Cixi did not embrace industrialization indiscriminately or unreservedly. In 1882, when Earl Lee asked for permission to build textile factories, she objected, saying with annoyance, "Textile making is our basic domestic industry. Machine-produced fabrics take away our women's work and harm their livelihood. It is bad enough that we can ban foreign textiles. We shouldn't be inflicting further damage on ourselves. This matter must be considered carefully." In those days, textile making was called kangshang, literally meaning silkworms and mulberry leaves, as silk production had been a major activity of Chinese women for thousands of years. To maintain this tradition, every year in spring, when the silkworm began their labor, Cixi led court ladies to pray in a special shrine in the Forbidden City to the god of the silkworm, begging his protection for the little worms. She and the ladies would feed the silkworms 4 or 5 times a day, gathering leaves from the mulberry trees in the palace grounds. When a silkworm had finished spinning a silk thread and had enclosed itself inside the cocoon it had made with its silk, the cocoon would be boiled and the thread, which averaged many hundreds of meters, would be wound onto a spool, ready for weaving. All her life, Cixi kept some of the silk she had woven as a young girl to see if the new silk was as fine and as lustrous as the old. She did not want to see the old ways disappear altogether. While she was determined to drive through change in some areas, in others she either resisted change or accepted it only reluctantly. Under her, China's industrialization did not move like a bulldozer out to destroy all the traditions.